Tim, are you out there?
I am, Dom. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. So we've got our next session coming up, which we put the greening of streaming in the middle of the morning because it's sort of segues between the core IP and the submarine infrastructures and so on, and the data centers where all the computers are running, doing all the clever things to enable the content to be delivered and so on. Tim, tell us a little bit about the next session, and you might want to pick up on the comments that were going on in the chat room as well, but I'll leave that to you.
Well, let's actually talk briefly about the comments that were going on. One of the comments that somebody made was works beautifully falling into this, talking about programming microprocessors. You know, that could be FPGAs, it could be GPUs, ASICs, what have you. One of the other comments that came up was somebody said something about a leftist agenda. And I know you, Dom, have mentioned that one of the pieces of feedback across the UK when the article came out was people saying, you know, don't tell me I can't stream. I will say I am not left by any means. I am further to the right of center. But I think this was a really important thing both you and I talked about, and Eric, to found, because functionally we are going to be one of the biggest power consumers in the world as streaming goes on. So how we solve this problem isn't a leftist agenda, isn't a rightist agenda. It's an agenda that's really important for we as the industry and ultimately globally. Now, does it mean we all have to do our part? Yes. And I think that is something that ultimately we will all figure out how to step up to. So I really appreciated Adam's comments on that. Now, on this particular panel, we've got Greg Jones from NVIDIA, and we've got Nehal from Intel. Nehal, again, thank you for joining on this panel. Greg, are you out there?
I am.
Fantastic.
If you can hear me, I am, yeah.
Okay, awesome. We can't see you quite at the moment.
Yeah, it says the host has stopped my video, so.
All right.
This is Eric in the background here. I just made you co-host, so you should be able to turn it on now.
Awesome. There we go. Very good. Yep.
Well, Greg, so how are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thanks. How are you?
Can't complain. You still have the guitars behind you that we saw a couple of seats.
Yeah. I play as poorly as I ever have. So yeah, nothing has changed.
So have you added anything back there that we hadn't seen last time around?
Nope, all the same equipment. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So again, Greg Larson from NVIDIA. And Greg, what's your title?
I'm part of the XR team, so I direct the product management and the business development for our XR team. So XR NVIDIA at NVIDIA stretches across multiple verticals. So we're kind of an interior horizontal type of group.
Fantastic. And then Nehal, you had your hat on a moment ago for greening of streaming, but what's your focus, day to day within Intel?
So I manage the CDN segment for Intel. I'm a segment director at Intel Corporation, and also lead some of our Visual Edge initiatives, mainly focused at the network edge.
Got it. Very good. Now, one of the questions, so we talked about the 3 Ps, price, performance, power. Let's come back to performance for a bit, because obviously that's a big question everybody has. And obviously if we can get to better performance at lower power, that's good. But fundamentally, what are some of the compute issues that a CDN faces, and how does sort of high density computing work in that space?
Well, I'll say, oh, go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Greg. Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I focus on XR, which is, streaming XR is a really interactive workload. It's a high-end render workload, so the compute power is quite significant on the GPU, and the latency requirements are really tight. So kind of stepping out of the traditional CDN, when you start talking about not just streaming but streaming interactive loads, the compute goes up at the edge, the requirement, and as you think of putting in artificial intelligence in those workloads. So let's say I'm not just streaming a video from the GPU, but I'm asking the GPU to have a conversational AI on it, so that I don't use a GUI, and now my compute's going to be a inference on speech, which is a pretty heavy workload. Then I'm going to grab even more compute at that edge, or maybe a little deeper into the network. So we're in that interactive streams, we're going to see compute actually go up at the edge and also ping into the data center, depending on the latency of the workload.
Okay, and we'll come back to talk about AI and ML in a few minutes, but Nehal, from Intel's standpoint.
Yeah, so traditionally, in the current CDN deployments, mainly, it really depends on the use cases, right? Predominantly, it's VOD and live streaming. And I think for both of those, you do need decent amount of compute. One of the trends that we have been seeing is that most of the video content today is now encrypted. So you do need techniques to, manage your crypto, either in your CPUs, or if the software is not optimized, then you have to find a way to offload those functions. Increasingly, there is the shift that we see happening where more and more of like the infrastructure functions, whether it's security, whether it's firewall kind of features, cryptography, all of those appear to be maybe moving out of the CPU and potentially being targeted to be done on DPUs or IPUs. But then there are also this application specific workloads. So if your target is to deliver cloud gaming, right, then obviously you do need dense accelerators to perform that. So I think it's very dependent on what you're targeting, what your target use case is. But generally speaking, I think for traditional CDN use case, which is all about live streaming and WAD, I think there's decent amount of compute that is available out there today.
Now you mentioned encryption. Is that for VOD? Is that encryption both at rest, where the file is sitting, and in transport, or
I think it's mainly when you're establishing the connections. So if your connections are in keep alive state, right, you only need to do it initially. But if you need to refresh it and we are managing maybe thousands of connections, right, there's lots of overhead involved with it.
Okay, so let's talk about edge compute and sort of edge cases. This is an area that obviously is growing, at least in popularity, whether it's actually growing in revenues. But where does sort of edge compute come into play when we're talking about high performance computing? And Greg, I'll let you go ahead first on this one. I think you might be muted.
Sure enough, as Nehal mentioned, everything's really workload dependent. I mean, very specifically workload dependent. So for XR, for instance, if I'm doing my graphics at the edge, my latency is critical, right? I've got 20 milliseconds motion to photon, and I can do some warping of the frame, so I can tolerate a 40 millisecond connection. So that gets me to a lot of regional data centers in many areas. But if I'm going to include hands and other data into that, then my latency becomes a problem. If my hands lag too much, and it's hard to adjust the frame with hands. So now I'm back into needing, a 20 millisecond connection. So it really depends on, if I'm an auto designer, I'm using XR, I'm probably okay with that 20 to 40 millisecond connection. If I'm someone, depending on my hand movement, if I'm surgical, I'm using remote streaming to guide a surgery, then you're going to want the hands to be really crisp, and you're going to be in the 5 to 10 milliseconds. So you're really at the edge. Right? So it depends on where your edge is, and it depends on what you're doing. And so for people that have the edge that is defined by Amazon wavelength, for instance, they've got a 10 to 15 millisecond connection, I think it is, in Los Angeles, and that's great. Other edges will be regional data centers or even outpost type of installs, so on-prem, and you'll it's going to be a crazy mapping. And then if you dive into the workload, the graphics is one piece, the hand movement's another, and that artificial intelligence piece will have different latencies associated with it. And then if you think about autonomous vehicles like cars and what data they need, same thing, there'll be these kind of nested latencies. Like I want to know what the traffic around me is doing very, very quickly. And so latencies will need to be short. That'll be an edge load, and then other things will migrate back into the, the regional data centers.
Interesting. And especially when you talk about things like LiDAR, obviously it's going to receive its data back very quickly. The bottleneck becomes the latency of moving it off the vehicle itself. So,
yeah.
Nehal, from an Intel perspective, edge compute and high performance computing.
Yeah, I think I would like to start with, where Greg was making a point about locality, and, his spot on that, much of it depends on your target use case and where you need the compute to be in terms of locality. So there is this on-prem compute, right, which is for use cases where you need absolutely, low latency, you need to have compute on-prem. And then there are use cases where maybe you could do with a little bit of latency, and it could be potentially be served on the network edge. What we are seeing right now is that there's lots of interest in IoT and enterprise space, be it use cases related to retail or industrial sectors, or even smart city, transportation, logistics. And all of this aligns very well with the rollout of 5G private wireless technology. But all of this is also a great opportunity for the network edge to provide a new kind of business model where, if you're doing things on-prem, then typically it's very heavy on the CapEx burden, right, for the enterprises. And the network edge, where the CDN is, if you could potentially move some of your workloads over to the network edge, it now offers you a new OpEx-driven model where it's a shared infrastructure across multiple enterprise customers. So we're certainly seeing a shift where many of the traditional CDN providers, they have already proven that with use of web technology, they can offer a foundation for serverless compute. In addition to that, they have developed features to bring in support for even stateful data, which is very unique. And the belief is that maybe potentially the edge infrastructure at the network can bring in lots of value to many of these use cases.
And it's also an interesting discussion, having worked in eCDNs in the past, enterprise CDNs, as the price points fell for large CDNs, it sort of begged that question of, let's just move it all off-prem. But as you say, there are certain things you sort of need to do on-prem. So are we seeing with CDN evolving, will it evolve back to sort of a hybrid eCDN/CDN model, or what will that look like?
Well, go ahead, Greg.
Oh no, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I think it remains to be seen. There is a belief in different camps where some do believe that yes, it could be done. One of the shifts that we are seeing is that again, it comes down to the actual margins, right? So when you think about video delivery, we all know that the margins are razor thin and there's hardly money to be made. And with that, we see that many of the CDN providers are increasingly pivoting more towards high margin use cases, be it web e-commerce, be it IoT, edge computing use cases, right? So it remains to be seen, how the transformation will take place, but there is an opportunity and a potential out there.
So, Greg, you mentioned AI and machine learning. What value can AI bring to a CDN? And you mentioned briefly, of course, the concept of you want you want the compute itself to be having those AI conversations, but sort of on a broader level, what does machine learning bring to high performance compute for CDN specifically?
Yeah, to contextualize the way I think of AI and such is, you know, I want to, especially let's take this enterprise idea and whether we should have on-prem compute or how much we can do, you know, just off-prem in the network. And so I'm assuming a pretty grand future with digital twins, right, where we're being informed on the factory floor of how things are working, whether that's a quality check on a part I'm holding and I have AR glasses looking at that part and I have some AI algorithm doing a quick scan on that to give me a quality check against a reference of that part, right? So that image processing, the automatic segmentation of that image, the quick process, that's probably a 100 millisecond workload you can have, you know, a ways away. So that doesn't necessarily need to be on-prem. Then you get into, you know, that part data, maybe I want to keep that on-prem under a certain security protocol. And so I don't want that in the network. So you jump into not only latencies, but where do I want my data to sit? And so what we're seeing is a variety of providers going out and building on-prem data centers and operating those data centers as a contractor. And that's largely, you know, this is where I want my data to be, is on-prem within a pretty strict security profile. And so we're seeing things other than just compute and where it sits, where the latency is, but data considerations. But I think as you do more and more with factory floor data in digital twins, you'll see more and more on-prem compute standing, whether it's a latency requirement or a security requirement. You'll see more and more of that migration from pure network to on-prem.
Okay, interesting. And I like the fact that you're bringing up perspectives beyond just media and entertainment, because clearly things like surgical that you're talking about, shop floor, inventory control even are highly important. Nehal, media and entertainment obviously is used sort of the AI ML model. What's your sort of sense of where ML benefits CDNs?
Yeah, it's definitely coming into the forefront. You know, it's like you said, it's been in heavy use in the media and entertainment space, from encoding to compression to maybe even the ad tech industry. But particularly in the CDN space, we are seeing interest from CDN providers on use cases related to doing better with fault detection, or bringing in automation for the log management. And when you have like thousands of edge nodes and you have all this log data coming in, it does help to, you know, bring in automation so that you can be more responsive. The other use case that we have heard about is around dynamic ad insertion, where, you know, the thinking has been that, you know, you can provide more personalized advertisement by offering dynamic ad insertion capability on the CDN infrastructure itself. We have not seen it taken off yet. You know, it's still mostly being done in the cloud as opposed to maybe bringing it on the CDN edge. The other area that comes to my mind is applying ML techniques for addressing zero-day attacks. So it's becoming a great tool for advancements of security features related to, you know, web security or even content security. So lots of advancements and developments taking place around ML.
So I want to go back real quick to what you said about the dynamic ad insertion, because to me, this would be a perfect use case for edge compute. Ultimately, bring the assets down that are sort of the standard assets across the board, and then localize them by inserting via, you know, alpha channel, the local phone number, the local, say, car dealership's address, and their last little 2-second blurb that goes on a 30-second commercial. Why do you think we're not seeing those kinds of use cases being pushed out to the edge as opposed to staying closer to the core?
Well, there might be multiple reasons. There's probably some business barriers too. There is in my view, there is a set value chain. Like, you have an existing value chain that is already serving the whole ed tech industry, right? And they can potentially do things by computing it in the cloud for now. They're not seeing huge maybe ROI in having to push this deeper in the CDNs yet. There could be some business challenges, which maybe I'm not aware of. But technology-wise, it looks like the technology is there if you would want to do it. And I agree with you. It's a great tool to bring in personalization, whether it's for advertisement or for all kinds of content.
So Greg, from your standpoint, I know you obviously, like you said, you're working in XR. What about this personalization piece, from an edge compute standpoint? How does that play?
I think, yeah, for edge compute, just like putting ads on things, inserting ads, if you think of customizing the content, and it doesn't have to stick with just alpha channel type ideas. If you want to up-res the content, colorize the content at the edge, let's say I have a certain screen that you're streaming to, and I will pay for up-resing that. Those kind of new compute altering the content, personalizing the content can be done in a variety of ways. And I think what we're starting to see is, POCs on that, but the CapEx expenditure to put that edge compute out there is still trying to be justified.
Okay.
Right. So we're seeing a lot of exploration by the telcos. I see a ton of exploration in XR, but that's along with other CDN type of ideas. So there's a lot of exploration, and everybody's looking for the killer use case to justify a CapEx expenditure to put that edge compute node out there, and where to put it. Right. Some real estate's a little bit more pricey than others. Sure. in that space. So
speaking of sort of those justifiable CapEx expenditures, what about high performance compute for web acceleration? I mean, where do we see that going? And are web accelerators sort of commodities at this point, or is that still something that's a specialized market CDNs are going after?
Yeah, the workloads I see, in the XR, so I'll drill into the XR. We're still trying to figure out what web accelerators will work with XR, with VR and AR workloads, and what aren't. So we're still quite a ways from having a great idea on what will be needed to, accelerate, browser type content for that workload. It's still a little complex, so it's a little bit more bespoke rather than rely on web accelerators.
Yeah, no, fair point, definitely with XR. Nehal, what about from a sort of general web browser standpoint?
Yeah, I believe when it comes to the web use cases, you have a little bit of lever on not being in the super low latency space compared to when you're doing something like video streaming, or if you're involved in the cloud gaming, right? It's more latency sensitive, or even if you have like immersive use cases like AR, VR, it's very prone to the latency. But for web e-commerce kind of use cases, you could pretty much use all the compute that's available to you in the hyperscaler environment, in the big cloud environment. And, it's all a matter of provisioning the compute that you need. So I don't see any bottlenecks there. It's mainly a software-driven workload.
Okay. And then as our last question, I'm going to sort of combine two parts here. What's the future of compute for CDNs? And I got a question that popped up here specific to that. What application do we expect will be the next in the CDN delivery chain to move from sort of general CPUs to more specialized silicon? And we'll end with that particular question.
Okay.
Nehal, you can go first.
Okay. So, what I see happening next is, we have been focusing at the node level. I'm expecting that, as we move towards more and more powerful nodes. The focus is likely to move at a system level on, how can you deal with things like network congestion? How can you do better? And on your second question on maybe what else besides CDN, when you look at all of the emerging use cases across the board, be it media analytics, cloud gaming, AR, VR, it does feel like maybe cloud gaming is now moving into more of a maturity phase of all the different use cases. So it definitely appears that that one might be next. Although, it's very likely that you might need dedicated infrastructure to meet your requirements for cloud gaming, rendering being key part of it. But I also feel that, there is still room where, you could also offload many of the infrastructure functions, be it networking, be it storage, to bring in disaggregated storage functionality to CDN edge nodes. And all of those would be good use cases for things like FPGA, IPUs, DPUs, or even smart NICs.
Okay, very good. And Greg, you live at the edge, no pun intended, of XR, AR, VR. What do you see next, even beyond that, for high performance compute?
Yeah, so I see the DPU taking a lot of work off the CPU, right? And we're going to need to know more and more about each packet. We're going to need to use that in the queuing schedulers and such. And so how to label that, how to move that label into the queue, how to tell those gaming platforms not to send an iframe because our schedulers, our queues are full, right? We don't have room for that bigger frame. So a lot of diffing in there. There's going to be so much more information about what we're sending to do the queuing correctly. And I think that's where the optimization in both 5G and 6G will happen. And so that anything we can do to offload the queuing type of workload and the security workload, so the encryption, off the CPU so it can man all that. There's going to be a lot of GPUs laying around doing rendering in many of these workloads, and the CPU is going to have its hands full communicating those workloads. So anything you can put on the DPU will be a really nice piece of hyper-converged, kind of the new servers coming out. Yeah.
Oh, very good. All right. Well, Nehal, Greg, thank you very much for your insights here today. This panel to me is always interesting because it's the one that lets us start thinking about the beyond, even though we're still way down the OSI stack. And Dom, with that, I'm going to hand it back to you.
As always, a fantastic session. Thank you very much, Tim, Greg, and Nehal. Let me just zip along the line and get a wave from everyone. So there's Nehal. Thank you very much for two half-hour sessions back to back. Well done, sir. That's a feat for sure. And we've got Greg. Thank you for dialing in last minute. It's really appreciated. Always good to see you, sir. Must have a jam sometime when we're not doing proper work things. That would be good. That would be good. And Tim, thank you very much for hosting. It's always good to hear your input and have your guidance, and you're back for several sessions a bit later on. So we'll see you.
Yeah, you're not getting rid of me quite that quickly today. So
no, I will have questions for you later though, because I like to throw the curveball.